Hello everyone, welcome to this webcast on how to master peer review. My name's Jack, I'm the moderator today. After this little pre-recorded message, we're going to hear from Matthew Stiller-Reeve, who's going to talk about his experiences making a structured process for peer review. After that, we'll hear from Rebecca Baglini, who's going to talk about her experiences creating a neutral language framework for peer review. And some advice for others to do something similar. And finally, we'll hear from Theo van der Broek, who's going to talk about his experiences starting an entire journal for postdoctoral researchers, in part to gain some experience in peer review. Hopefully, with those three perspectives, we'll get some interesting questions and discussions going. So if you do have a question at any point during this process, please do feel free to click the Ask a Question button somewhere around this web page, and we'll get to them as soon as we can in the live event. Thanks so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy.
Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Stiller-Reeve and I live on a small island called Austerley on the west coast of Norway. Until recently, I was a climate researcher at the Bjerknes Centre for Climate Research and the Norwegian Research Centre, not too far away from here in Bergen. These days though, I'm a freelance consultant and I work a lot on science communication projects as well as sustainability projects, and I also spend a lot of time teaching academic writing skills to early career scientists, which I really enjoy. So today I'm going to be talking about peer review, and just to start things off, we're going to backtrack a couple of years when I started to realise something which I'm sure many of you have realised already, that we don't get enough training in peer review in our scientific education. At the same time as I was making this realisation, I was also embarking on my duties as a thematic editor of a journal called Geoscience Communication, where I wanted to be sure I knew what I was talking about before guiding other people through this same peer review process. So I did a lot of reading, and I was lucky enough to join forces with Bronwyn Wake from Nature Climate Change and also Grant Vaughan from Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics. And we designed a course that we put on at the European Geoscience Union conference in Vienna, all about peer review. We presented ideas about peer review, and we also designed and presented a step-by-step process, or basically a kind of instruction manual that early career scientists could follow when starting out on their first peer review processes. On the back of this course and the instruction manual here, or the instruction manual that we wrote, not the IKEA version here, of course, I wrote a short article for nature.com, or for Nature Careers, that came out in 2018 that you can access here, that walks you through the step-by-step process, and where you can also get hold of this PDF of this worksheet that will also walk you through this peer review process. So I thought today I would briefly go through step by step with you what's in this article and in the step-by-step process, and hope that it might be of some help to some of you. So the peer review process is a big responsibility, and with big responsibilities sometimes comes a little bit of stress. So I highly recommend, when starting out with your first peer reviews, you're very relaxed, and preferably you should find a comfortable place, a cozy place to sit and go through those first peer reviews. So once you've found that comfortable place, be ready to read the article that you've been asked to peer review 3 times. Not all in one go, but 3 times nonetheless. Okay, but before we get started on the reading, I just want for you guys to keep in mind something very important that I think is important to frame the whole process. So I'm a big advocate of politeness and professionalism in peer review. And you can reject a paper for sure, but you can do it also in a constructive and polite manner. So keep in mind these wise words. Review for others as you would have others review for you. Or put more playfully maybe, during the peer review process, be on the side of the authors. Be part of their fan club, basically. Even if you think a paper is written badly or the science isn't up to scratch, you have to remember that a lot of work has gone into that paper, and with your help, even if it's not published this time around, it could be improved and published in the same journal or another journal at a later stage. So right, let's get on with the first reading. During this first reading, you really want to be getting an overview or concentrating on some umbrella issues, basically, about the paper. So once you've read through one time, I want you to try and jot down a draft for mirroring the article. And what do I mean by mirroring the article? Basically, you want to write a short statement about what the article is about, why it's important, what the main question is of the article, and how the authors have managed to answer it. So this mirroring of the article is really important, and it's not just useful for you, it's also very useful for the authors. So if you write something that the authors disagree with, then hopefully they'll take that as a message that they maybe have to refine the way they're communicating their messages within the paper. The second thing I'd like you to do after this first reading is be open about your own expertise. Be open about your expertise and how your expertise lies in relation to the science that's in the paper. So you don't have to be an expert on every aspect of the paper to give a useful peer review. However, it's really useful for the authors, the editor, and basically the whole process if you describe how your expertise does relate to what's inside the paper. And finally, in the first read through, if you noticed, you possibly noticed what some of us call a fatal flaw that will stop the peer review process in its tracks, basically. So this might be the fact that entire sections that are necessary but are actually missing. Or maybe, unfortunately, the writing just makes it impossible for you to understand the research story. So no matter what it is, you can obviously reject the paper at this stage if the flaw is big enough. But again, you can do it in a polite manner. So, all right, you've done your first reading. You can take a break, maybe a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days. But when you come back to your comfortable place again, you can be ready for the second reading. Reading number 2. Right. This time around, you're going to be focusing on the scientific nuts and bolts of the paper. Basically, this is what will take up most space in that final peer review document, more than likely at least. And so therefore, this part of the peer review will probably take most time as well. So here we'll go through section by section, and you'll ask questions like, do the abstract and the introduction introduce the importance and relevance of the research that's been done, and of course present the question that's going to be answered. Does the methods section present the methods, and are the methods relevant for targeting that main question, or are they appropriate in general in the discipline that you're a part of? Are the results presented clearly and logically, and are the figures clearly and fully described? And do the discussions and not least the conclusions, are they justified in relation to the data or the results that are presented earlier on in the paper? And are they justified in response to the questions that were asked in the introduction? So at this stage, you really want to split your feedback between major and minor issues. And this is maybe quite subjective if you think about it, the discrepancy between major and minor issues, but it can be a very helpful way to communicate to the authors what you put most emphasis on. And it's also a very good indication to the authors about what possibly they need to spend more time on refining further into the peer review process with their response to your peer review. So take a break again and come back to your comfy place, ready for your third and final reading. So this time around, you'll be looking at some of these fine-tuning issues of the paper, like I like to call them, and you'll be concentrating more on the writing and the structure and the formulation of the paper. So the science may be great, but it may be bogged down, for example, in heavy composition or an illogical structure between the paragraphs, for example, and things like this. Again, you wanted to split your comments here between major and minor issues, but don't just write, for example, that the writing is bad. Try and explain why. So try and explain to the authors, for example, that you think that they should use the active voice more throughout the text, or possibly there's a super long paragraph that you've noticed that needs to be split into 2 or maybe 3 other paragraphs so that they really convey those ideas within those paragraphs more clearly. Great, so now you've completed your 3 readings and you have your notes. Now all that remains is for you to compile all those notes into that final peer review document that you're going to send off to the journal. And you can build this document basically in the same way as, or the same order as the issues that you've considered during the 3 readings. So you can start with a positive introduction, and you want to mirror that article again, state your expertise in relation to the research that you're considering. You then want to follow up with the major flaws or the major issues. Again, it's a really good idea at this point to arrange these major flaws or major issues with bullet points. So it's easier for the author then to respond, and it's also easier for yourself and the editor then to keep track of the peer review discussion as it goes on. After the major flaws, you want to again do the same with the minor flaws. Again, it's a really good idea to present these also as bullet points. And finally, you want to round off with some lesser suggestions. Maybe you've seen some typos you want to draw the author's attention to, or some grammatical mistakes. And then finally, round off with some positive comments. So even if you're rejecting the paper, you can still say that you'd be happy to, if you are happy to, review a resubmission, for example, or at the very least, you can wish the authors luck in further developing their research story and maybe presenting it, or submitting it to another journal at a later stage. So just to review, you can get started with creating thorough peer reviews by concentrating on different elements of the paper split between 3 different readings. So the first reading, you want to be looking at the overarching issues where you identify the main aim of the paper and you mirror the article, as we've talked about already. The second reading, you want to concentrate on the scientific nuts and bolts of the paper, ensure that the research has been carried out well, the results are justified and all the important elements are in place. And a third reading, you'll concentrate more on these fine-tuning issues, and you'll give a response to the writing and the presentation of the paper on the whole. And I'd really like you to think hard about the ways that you can write all of these different criticisms and issues, because your choice of words and phrases can really make a big difference to the overall tone of the peer review. But this is something that Rebecca Baglini is going to give you some great tips on in just a minute, I think. So, the article that outlines this step-by-step process, again, is available at this link, along with the worksheet, the PDF of the worksheet that you can also download and use through your peer review processes. So, all I can say is good luck with your peer reviews, and remember, above all, review for others as others would, or you would have others review for you.
Thank you so much for that talk, Matthew. We're now going to move on to Rebecca Baglini's talk on using language in peer review.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Baglini, and I'm an assistant professor of linguistics at Aarhus University. Back in November, I co-wrote a careers column article with my colleague Christine Parsons called If You Can't Be Kind, Be Neutral, in which we present some recommended language guidelines for better peer reviews. So I'll be sharing some of those with you today. Now, as we all know, peer review is the primary means of quality control in academic research publishing, but it largely consists of uncompensated volunteer labor. This means that scholars have to find the time to do peer review on top of all of their other professional work. And it means that it's sometimes treated as an afterthought or a frustrating obligation, and not given the kind of time or care it deserves. Now, on top of this, unlike with the writing of manuscripts, most graduate programs offer no systematic training for junior scholars on how to write peer reviews. And journals themselves offer very few or no concrete guidelines on how reviewers are expected to conduct the review and how they should express their opinion. Now, we think that the lack of concrete guidance and norms, especially on the language used in peer reviews, can lead to very real problems. This is bolstered by a recent survey of 1,100 STEM scientists from around the world who found that at least half have received at least one unethical or irrelevant review in the course of their career. And respondents from underrepresented groups, like scientists of color, women or non-binary scientists, reported the greatest relative harm to their scientific productivity and career advancement as a result of these unprofessional reviews. Now, we think it's up to journals to flag reviews that are openly unprofessional, discriminatory, or hostile. But we want to point out that there are also more subtle language devices that don't cross the line into being unprofessional, but that, in the aggregate, can allow subjectivity and bias to overwhelm constructive criticism. We call these language devices non-neutral language, and we define them as language that serves only to reflect the writer's attitude, emotional state, or subjective viewpoint. Let's look at an example of what I mean. Here we have a neutral statement that we might see in a review of a grant proposal. The project proposal didn't fulfill the requirements stated in the call. Now, we call this neutral because this sentence is a simple matter of fact. It's either true or false, and anyone could check the evidence and come to the same conclusion as the reviewer. Now, let's add in a bit of non-neutral language, that is, language that centers the reviewer's emotional or subjective stance, and see how it changes the original sentence. The project proposal didn't even fulfill the requirements. The proposal didn't bother to fulfill the requirements. The proposal failed to fulfill the requirements. This unpolished proposal didn't fulfill the requirements. Now, notice that none of the words in red add anything factual to the first sentence. So they're really just reframing the statement of fact in a more critical manner by centering the reviewer's subjective opinion or by presupposing laziness or failure on the part of the writer, instead of just leaving the neutral statement alone. Let's put some labels on some of these non-neutral language devices we've just seen. Now, the first three types of words are really about centering the feelings of the reviewer, starting with subjective adjectives and nouns like careless, uninteresting, simple, poor, a mess, a dud. These words reflect personal feelings, tastes, or opinions that reasonable people can disagree about. So they shouldn't play a major role in peer review since they are subject to wide disagreement. Then we have speaker-oriented adverbs in a similar vein, like surprisingly, obviously, and disappointingly. These also represent the reviewer's attitude, but specifically about the truth of the statement that follows. The next set of words, depreciatory modifiers and implicative verbs, introduce what linguists call implicatures. So they allow the reviewer to imply something without stating it directly. For example, modifiers like at least, didn't even, barely, or just introduce implicatures that minimize, dismiss, or depreciate the content of the main sentence. For example, this is just a hypothesis. Implicative verbs, in contrast, imply something about what was needed for an event to take place or not take place. For example, the applicant didn't bother to do a thorough literature review implies that the literature review is lacking because the applicant didn't take the needed time or care. But notice that the same point could be made more fairly and accurately by simply stating that the literature review is not thorough, it's not complete, without casting aspersions on the reason why. Now, non-neutral language is not just limited to words. Stylistic choices can also be a source of non-neutrality in peer reviews. Some of the devices we point out in our article include narrativizing, like, at this point I almost stopped reading. Rhetorical questioning, like, did the authors even read the submission guidelines? Universalizing, like, as anyone knows, or as every expert knows. And speculating, like, I bet the outlier observations were omitted. Now, some of you might have noticed that of all the language types I've discussed here, they can also be used to convey positive sentiment. So, for example, impressively, the authors even managed to provide a comprehensive literature review despite the unforgivingly short page requirements. Now, that would be a really nice thing to see in one of your reviews, right? But whether positive or negative, it's still the case that non-neutral devices can compromise the objectivity of a review and unfairly influence an editorial or funding decision, especially if they're overused or over-relied upon. So we want to advise writers to take care to not over-rely on non-neutral language, even if it's highly positive. Another reason to recommend restraint with positive non-neutral language is because there have been found to be gender disparities in its use and deployment. So men and women have been shown to differ in the rate that they include positive sentiment words in the description of their own and others' research. And in recommendation letters, male postdoctoral candidates are more likely than female postdoctoral candidates to be described using subjective terms such as brilliant, rising star, pioneer, genius, and trailblazer. So this can be a particular problem in cases of non-blind or single-blind reviews. So we have some suggestions for how to better avoid non-neutral language in your own peer reviews. First, remember that researchers should write reviews with the same level of professionalism and formality as they write their own manuscript submissions. Be as explicit and concrete in your assertions as possible, and if you find a word or expression that would not belong in a research article, consider whether it belongs in a review. Second, although reviews provide opinions, the real focus is on the grounds for that opinion, not how strongly the reviewer expresses it. So you want to rely on evidence, not on emotionality. Ensure that every positive and negative evaluation is coupled with an explanation for why that evaluation is warranted. Often, simply stating the evidence or for quality or lack thereof is sufficient without further centering of the reviewer's feelings. Third and finally, you should try to judge a submission holistically and make sure to set aside time to read it through once or twice before you start compiling your comments. Try to avoid reviewing papers when you're already stressed or in a bad mood. And remember that you're reviewing the submission, not the person, and not your experience of reading the submission. And finally, remember this: you can't always be kind in peer review, but you can always try to be neutral. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that presentation. We're now going to move on to Theo van der Broek, who's going to talk about his experiences starting a journal from scratch to gain some peer review.
Hi, I'm Theo. I started the scientific journal in 2019 because I was looking for experience in peer review. In this webcast, I wanted to continue on why I started a new journal from the broader perspective of career development for myself and others. First off, I would like to give credit and thanks to the people that were part of founding the journal. With Nimrod, at the time a postdoc at MIT and now an associate professor at the University of Vermont, I co-founded the idea of a journal. Together with Partha, an enthusiastic publisher, we created the journal. With the support of the postdoc community, the Journal of Life Sciences was launched in June 2019. During my PhD and postdoc, I realized that a research scientist has many different roles and wondered what makes a real research scientist. To name some of the roles a research scientist has besides performing research, a scientist also has a role of an educator by training other scientists as well as non-scientists. He or she is a writer, writing scientific articles, grants, and articles for non-scientists. The scientist is a speaker, communicating their research at, for instance, conferences, and is also a business person, knowing how to run a research laboratory with all the necessary equipment, personnel, and supplies. A scientist is also a supporter of science. A scientist, as a career, is also not without his disappointments. A scientist is also a reviewer of the research of peers via grants and articles. A research scientist is therefore not just only a person who performs research, but is an all-rounder. I was trying to become an all-rounder scientist. The triple model put forward by the University of Utrecht nicely underlines that research is not the only factor in the scientist that should be rewarded or recognized in academia. Every letter in the triple model highlights a specific component: team, research, impact, professional performance, leadership, and education. Team spirit and leadership form the base of the flower as they support the three cores: research, education, and professional development, where academia generates outcomes. Impact is represented by the heart of the flower and connected to these three cores and represents the impact they have on science and society. The goal is to recognize the strengths of the scientist and further focus and set goals within these domains. With this model in mind, I reflected on which experience I still need to further develop as a scientist. To further advance my development as an educator, I attended the Science Teaching Scientists course as well as the undergraduate mentoring workshop to get a better understanding of the different teaching techniques and how to apply these techniques to mentoring undergraduates. To increase my development as a leader and professional investigator, I attended the course that focused on leadership and management skills, as well as how to establish my own academic lab. I also wanted to know more and get more experience in reviewing, as I thought I had too little experience. But how do you get more reviewer experience? I considered and tried several ways of getting more reviewer experience. A journal club could be a good start to critically read and review articles. However, most of these articles are already extensively reviewed and edited, so these journal clubs mostly discuss the contents of the article. The discussion of preprint articles at journal clubs might, however, also provide the possibility to actually review the article. Another option would be to review for your supervisor, for instance as a co-reviewer. Unfortunately, some supervisors let you co-review and write a peer review report and submit it under their own names. This is termed ghost reviewer. The best option would be to review with your supervisor and get constructive feedback on your report. In addition, there are numerous online training platforms available and are a great place to start your review training. I tried these above steps but wanted to get more frequent exposure to reviewing. So I contacted several scientific journals to ask them to consider me as a reviewer. Unfortunately, none of them were willing to consider my application as I was not senior enough or I needed more experience. So I went one step further and I made a scientific journal that would help me and others with getting a reviewer experience. So we had to decide how we wanted to construct this new journal. We wanted the journal to be an official journal that could be found worldwide. It had to be free to read articles, free to submit articles, or any other costs. The articles had to be peer-reviewed and of good quality, meaning they had to be scientifically, technically, and ethically valid, and not only focus on novelty and what's currently a hot topic. We wanted this journal to be part of the postdoc community, so everybody gets the opportunity to get experience in reviewing and even running certain parts of a journal. This also means that positions rotate, including myself as initial editor-in-chief. In addition, we wanted to provide a platform for postdoc to write editorials of specific interest to them. So this journal was launched June 2019 and we received a lot of support from the scientific community. And in the end, I did not get the opportunity to review a lot of articles, but I did experience so many other things from the editor side of view on the peer review process. If you think about starting a journal, you should have a look at go.nature.com, make a journal. With this, I've learned to make my own opportunities. I'm not saying everybody should create a journal, but try to identify what goal you want to reach and what is needed to get you there. Are you, for instance, able to attend classes, workshops, or seminars on the subject that would help you further? Discussing your goal or issues with others or a community might help you find and create a solution, as the journal was for me. Overall, I would say be passionate, proactive in finding and creating your own opportunities. So what's next? While I worked on completing my research scientist profile, I noticed a clear mismatch in career expectations and the reality, in both myself and many others. The majority of PhD students and postdocs seem to prefer the academic employment. Any other position is often referred to as if that person has left science, or if it wasn't the second choice or first choice. This group actually makes up the majority of scientists, up to 70% in the UK. This mismatch in career expectations and reality also seems to have a major impact on mental health and well-being of the scientist. I just want to make it clear that science is so much more than academia, and that it is an environment of careers and roles that are all integral to science. I believe that PhD students should be made aware of all the different possible career options during their training. I've listed several career options here below in the slide, but there are many, many more. This specific experience has sparked my interest in career development of scientists. As mentioned earlier, positions at Journal of Life Sciences would rotate, and as a result, I resigned as editor-in-chief and now joined the advisory board. In this new position, I share my prior experience with the new editor-in-chief, and I would also like to use this position to highlight the many different roles people can have in science. I've also started to put more emphasis on the education of young researchers and the career development by joining as a board member of the Young Dutch Society of Immunology and as a task force member of the Young European Federation of Immunological Societies. In addition, I try to promote overall global immunology education as ambassador for Immunopedia. Currently, I've put my scientific career on hold for the time being, and I have returned to my previous job as a medical doctor to do my part in this pandemic, hoping that at some point I will be a clinician scientist and have the opportunity to train my own students to become a more complete scientist. I hope my presentation has shed some light on why I thought it was necessary to start a scientific journal, and I've hopefully inspired you to advance your own science education or that of others. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Theo. We're now going to move into our live event, and we look forward to hearing your questions. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for to our speakers for also joining us. We are now live, as you may have guessed. We haven't quickly changed clothes whilst we're in between talks. So we've already got some excellent questions in. I'm going to run through some and hope that you guys can answer them. But if you do have any more questions, all of those at home watching, please do drop them in the chat. Should be somewhere around this screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So Matthew, I think I'm going to start with you, if that's all right, seeing as you're the first person to speak. Can I just ask you, I mean, this is a kind of real general question from Kate. How can I address a bad peer review that I've received? So do you have any particular advice for addressing a bad peer review that you have received yourself?
Oh, that's a question I can certainly relate to. I think the main thing that I could say, and also from experience, is with time. So I think many of you out there probably have also experienced this, received a review that's made you maybe not feel the greatest. And I certainly did that with my very first papers that got outright rejected. But the ones where I had the opportunity to actually respond and update the paper, again, they made me feel quite awful. Some of them were written quite harshly as well. But these days, I look upon these kind of reviews as, yeah, they're harsh, but there is useful information in there underneath the harshness. And putting those reviews, reading them for once, and then putting them aside for a couple of days, and then going back to it with a fresh mind, and trying to weed out the useful parts, and then listing up those and responding to them one after another, is probably the best advice I can give. So give it time. Even if you feel really awful right at the beginning, read through it once, put it aside, try and forget about it, come back to it, and try and weed out those useful elements and respond to those one after another, trying to be as polite as you possibly can be as well, of course.
Thanks very much for that. I'm going to jump on that answer actually with another question from Lee, who asks, what do you think is a reasonable overall time a reviewer should devote to reviewing a paper? This is kind of a question for all of you, I think. So do you have any kind of a, I don't know, do you have a specific time frame, or is it more complicated than that? Matt, why don't we start with you and go to Rebecca and then Theo, if that's right. Thank you.
It comes with experience, I think, for sure. There's research that's been done that shows that early career scientists and researchers use a lot more time and they put a lot more effort into their peer reviews than people with further on in their careers, and that's understandable, of course. But it depends. It depends on the length of the paper, how in depth it is, whether it's a review paper, whether it's a 25-page or a 3-pager, how much work's been gone into it, and obviously how much you need to respond to. If there's minor revisions, it's one thing. If there's major revisions, it's something else. But spending enough time and getting a good overview of the paper that you're comfortable talking about it with other people, and you have the knowledge of that paper, you feel comfortable with what's in that paper, talking about it. I think that's the main thing.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Matt has said. And I think since it's so context sensitive, how long it will actually take you to do the full review, I think the most important thing is once you accept a submission for review, really taking some time to be thoughtful and scheduling your time. How are you going to tackle this project? Where are you going to fit in those essential, at least 3, maybe even 4 read-throughs? So it'll depend, of course, on how long the paper is, how long this is going to take, and also what is the expected turnaround time of your of the journal. Always the journal or the grant committee, always be very sensitive to that and make sure you don't wait till the 11th hour. But yeah, make sure to practice good time management.
Thank you so much. Good advice for all areas of science, I suppose. Theo, is there anything you'd add to that in particular?
Not really much to add. I think we covered most of it. Out of my own experience, if the review is really within your research field, you can get it relatively done quickly because you know the current research, what has been done in the field. And sometimes you get reviews in a field that is different than yours, and you really have to first read a lot of other papers to really see what is new, what is interesting, what makes this paper stand out or add on top of the current research. And that takes a lot more time. So there's a big difference, like has been said by the other speakers, that it can be relatively short to take maybe even several days if you really have to go in depth to see what is being done.
So on that, actually, because I think that feeds into other questions that people are asking. I mean, do you feel that that's I think a lot of people are kind of asking whether or not that is appropriate, I guess. You know, if you do have to go into that kind of detail into background papers and other work and that kind of thing, would you maybe recommend just the journal looks for someone else to review that paper? Or I'm not sure if any of you got strong opinions on that.
I think I generally would. If it really seems outside of my area of expertise, and especially if I can think of other scholars in my larger discipline who I could recommend to the editor, I would do that and decline the opportunity to review.
Thank you. Theo, I imagine you've got quite a unique perspective on this, given your kind of experience starting a journal and whatnot. So, I mean, have you got anything else to add to that?
No, I think it's also, as a personal reviewer, I would think that if it's not in my field, I would also try to suggest others, or at least I would decline. And if I know other people, I would suggest them. It's not always the case. If it's within my field or very close to it, I would try to do it myself, but it's also sometimes dependent on how much time I have. If I know it's within my field, but it still needs some time and it's close to the deadline, I want to give a good review report. I don't want to do it and check something behind my own name. It's like, oh, I done it, but the writers will not have any proper benefit from it. Within the journal, we try to set up different fields of people that are, for instance, in microbiology or in immunology or pathology, and every field of life science, so we could have full representation of every field. And if we cannot find those people, we try to look for reviewers within that field.
Thank you.
I can add one little thing at the end there. As I think sometimes it's healthy to get people to review your paper who's slightly outside your discipline. And in these days, we're always trying to be as interdisciplinary as possible and have impact outside our disciplines. So on that note, I agree with what Theo and Rebecca have already said. But at the same time, I think it's healthy to have, because the editors aren't just automatic button pushing people at the other end of an internet wire. We're actually real people. So to have a conversation with the editor then instead of just maybe declining, but say, look, this is where my expertise lies. Could it be useful that I contribute to this review? Have you got other people who have specific expertise on the paper? And be open about the fact that you're looking at it in a slightly different, more maybe interdisciplinary angle.
Thanks very much, all of you. We've got an awful lot of questions flying in, and I think it's fair to say there's maybe some frustration creeping in from people's individual experience of peer review, which I'll try to kind of address constructively. One question we've got an awful lot is how do you, for one thing, differentiate between kind of grammatical, sorry, I'm phrasing that your question badly. I do apologize to whoever sent it in. My question is, how do you draw the line between bad language in peer review in terms of just bad English, where a paper maybe isn't immediately readable, and something that is what you called a major flaw, Matthew? So something where you, at what point, I suppose, do you reject a paper for bad language usage?
It's an interesting question, but I would say when you, as the peer reviewer, you can't weed out, you can't identify the main aim, what the process, the research process has been behind it, and you can't actually identify the main story arc of the whole paper at that point. But again, I said it in the presentation, you can still put that point across politely. We, as people who have got English as a first language within research, we're in an extremely lucky situation. I think it's very important for us to be conscious of how lucky we are within research. And even if people have difficulty writing, it doesn't mean they're doing bad research behind the difficulties they're having with their writing. So, but I do think you can flag that issue when it's just, you can't pick out those very, very important things with the research and then send that back.
Right. So you should be looking to simply understand the science. You're not looking to pick out individual errors in language usage, right?
I would say that, yeah.
Thank you. From one sort of type of language to another, I suppose, Rebecca, there's a question for you here from Sammy. They ask, what do you recommend can be done to change the behavior of your viewers? So it's kind of a cultural question, I suppose, who constantly use non-neutral language. So reviewers who consistently are, I almost said aggressive, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be aggressive, as you pointed out in your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, there are definitely some notoriously sort of negative and hostile reviewers. I think sometimes we even know them in our individual fields. They have a reputation. So first of all, I think that norms have to change on the collective level. There has to be more acknowledgement that hostile, unprofessional reviews are not tolerated in our research communities. But a big step towards changing the culture has to come from, I think, more deliberate and systematic training of early career researchers, especially PhD students. And I think a lot of us sort of acknowledged in our original articles and today that there isn't sufficient training on peer reviewing, even though it's such an essential part of being a professional academic. So actually training early career researchers on the norms for language usage and for neutrality. And then finally, I think that there is a role for editors as mediators in this process. And I do think that it is important for editors to pay attention when reviews cross lines into unprofessionalism and into offensive territories, or I think this is especially important now that we have real evidence that unprofessional and hostile reviews have real negative impacts on researchers, especially underrepresented researchers. So I think it's important for maybe editors to sometimes take up the mantle and to respond to a habitually aggressive reviewer and tell them that this will not be tolerated. They can also, of course, make suggestions for how to rephrase an otherwise constructive review.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Theo now with a couple of questions that we've got on for you. One's really general. It's simply, how can postdocs get involved in peer review? And I know you have some thoughts on that. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to plug a little bit. Someone else is asking, how do I get involved with the Journal of Life Sciences? So
Okay.
away you go. Thank you.
Well, one of the options, like you said, there are many options. Depends, I think, on your experience level. So like I listed in the presentation, you could first try to do journal clubs and especially use preprint articles to just discuss in the group what other people think. So you learn from maybe more superior or scientists that they have more experience to say, look into this and look into this. The other point will be with your supervisor. If they have time to go through it, I've had in my career also that my supervisor came to me with a paper that said, I need to review this. And sometimes in the sentence of, I don't have time for it, so you can do it. Or sometimes like, you could do it and then we can discuss it together later. And I think that will be a good setup because that will be a nice educational focal point as well. It is difficult to get into journals because they need experience. There are now more and more platforms arising, also by Nature and Publans Academy to have some sort of training or support. So there are several options. It doesn't come easily. It doesn't just approach. You have to look for it. So you could approach your supervisor, or you could try to set up your own journal club, specifically focus on preprints, or what is always also very nice, if somebody else is writing a paper within the lab, try to discuss it with others and be very open. Try not to create a hostile environment of a lot of negativity. Try to make a better paper. And you can discuss this because you're very early in the start. And in the sense of joining Journal of Life Sciences, we have on the website a contact email as well that you can approach us to see that you're interested in joining. And then we'll look into your application and then we'll approach you. But so there are several opportunities. I was just a bit frustrated because at the time I didn't have a lot of experience and I wanted to get it done quickly, and we didn't have a lot of journal clubs. I tried to online courses, which is to a certain point will teach you, and then after a certain point you just have to get experience. You just have to get exposure and keep doing it over and over, and you get experience with it. And it's the nicest if somebody who is more experienced with you can overlook your review report and see if you nicely highlighted the points in the article.
Thank you. Thanks. And I think the earlier point around sort of kindness in science, or at least professionalism in science, is something all of you have highlighted. And I think it's such an important thing to make clear. And it's kind of revealing that you will feel you kind of need to, I suppose, as well. And from the comments and questions we're getting in, I think a lot of other people have had kind of damaging or unprofessional peer reviews, which have frustrated them. So I'm gonna pick up on that mention of time you had there, Theo. There's a few questions here about sort of the appropriate time to wait when you're waiting to receive a peer review. So someone here has been waiting for 5 or 6 months to have to receive a review, and I just wondered if you guys had any opinions on that. Is 5 or 6 months too long? Should they chase the editor? Anything else they can be doing?
You can chase the editor politely. Again, editors are human beings as well. But 5 or 6 months is quite a long time. But the journal, for example, I'm an editor for Geoscience Communication. It's quite a recent journal, so not many people have heard of it. So sometimes, even though it's a great journal, of course, sometimes it's a bit challenging to actually get people to review. It takes time. It takes actually quite a lot of work for us associate editors to find the peer reviewers. So sometimes that process is lengthy, but you will also want to give the reviewers enough time to give good feedback or constructive feedback. So sometimes that timeline does extend. Basically, I would just try and have a nice constructive conversation with the editor about it, find out why, and then take it from there. Yeah.
Thank you. And equally, actually, someone else has asked, if a reviewer sends their review in too short a time, should you perhaps be worried by that? Should some alarm bells going off? So this person has said, if you receive a review back in 1 day, should you be celebrating with speed or be slightly worried about the quality of review?
Depends on the comments. If they say it's all well done, then you might be able to celebrate. But yeah, maybe that person just had a lot of time on the hand and they could finish it. So if it's like we mentioned before, if it's within your field, it can be done relatively quick. But if it's outside of your scope a bit or close to it. So like if it's really out of your scope, I would not review it. But if it's relatively close to it, it might take more time. But if it's right within your field and you're working on it, it might be done relatively quick. You know where the pitfalls are. You know the current questions that are being asked in that field. So it can be done relatively quick. If it just says 2 sentences, it's not a really nice review for you to build up upon to improve your paper. So it would be nice to get some criticism to see, okay, I improved the message and improved this, but you could try to maybe rephrase this, or you always see, could you put in this extra reference, which is sometimes the writer of the reviewer itself. But there are, it would be nice if you have a little bit of more of a detailed report, even if there are no real comments.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think that's fair enough. I'm going to address this question to Rebecca, simply because you haven't spoken for a while. I hope that's okay. I don't want you to put you on the spot. I've got a couple of questions here around plagiarism. So first of all, do you think it's appropriate for a reviewer to be checking for plagiarism? Do you think that's their responsibility? Should they be using software, for instance, or anything like that? Or should they just kind of call it out if they spot it, but don't necessarily look for it? And also, do you have any kind of thoughts on self-plagiarism? So if someone reuses data that they've maybe already published in a previous paper or anything like that. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something I've thought about an awful lot, but I would say to your first question, I'm not a huge fan of plagiarism detection software. For example, I don't use it on my students' papers either, but that's for sort of separate reasons. But I think adding that as another burden on reviewers is not something I would be in favor of. Of course, one of the things that we always do when we read a review is we're sensitive to other work that's in the same vein, and we may often suggest that the literature review be expanded to take into account similar work. But of course, if you were to see maybe too much similarity to another piece of work that you're aware of, that might be something to look into. And if it looks like it's actually a case of plagiarism or that would be something to probably flag with the editor. If it seems serious enough, maybe do that before continuing the review. And then the other question you had was about self-plagiarism. I think that's definitely straight up self-plagiarism, identical papers in multiple places, usually frowned on, but fields may differ in whether it's acceptable for a proceedings paper from a conference to be lightly edited and revised for a journal submission. So you really have to understand what the sort of norms are, both in your field and then the very particular rules for different venues. So certainly if a journal says this can't have been substantially reprinted elsewhere, then you need to flag that and probably suggest that the manuscript be rejected.
Thank you. One of the things this has got me sort of thinking about, along with some of the comments, is I guess around etiquette. So some of these questions, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to address as many as I can kind of in one question, are around kind of relationships with the editor. When should you get in touch with an editor? When's it appropriate to push back on a bad peer review? Do you need to respond to every comment? That kind of thing. And I think that maybe comes from not being quite sure about your relationship with an editor when you're having your paper reviewed. And I wondered if you guys had any tips to maybe build a good relationship with an editor, or just communicate well with someone as your paper goes through a peer review. I realize that's a long-winded question for any of you, but I just wondered if you got any particular thoughts on that. Theo, why don't I put you on the spot to start with? Thank you.
Well, what I've learned, I think that's of interest for all, that initially I was a bit scared of the editor. They're always having more of a negative feeling to it, like, oh, they only want to break down your paper or not. And along the way, when you write more and you contact more, actually they're really there to help you out. They're not to criticize your paper. They're not to make to reject your paper. They really try to help improve the language, the science in your paper. So if you have issues, for instance, with a review report that you think is out of proportion and is not right, I think you should be able to approach the reviewer and make your comments. Also, sometimes you get questions that you think are not reasonable. They would ask for a lot of additional experiments, and you really might consider they're really out of the scope or the aim of the paper, and that might be really more of interest of the reviewer. I've sometimes written in the review report that there are really indeed an interesting question to address, but it will be outside of the scope of the current article. If it's really close to it, you could discuss or contact the editor to see, do I really need to address this question or not? Because I believe it's not within the scope. And they could say, well, I agree with you, it's not within the scope or not. You don't have to answer this, or just reply shortly that it's without scope and experiments are not performed. Or if the editor thinks, no, we should really incorporate it because they would build on the current data or your science. So have an open relationship with the editor. I'm not saying that for everything they should just send an email. Most of the times it goes through your senior author of the paper or your PI that they contact the editor because you usually have already a relationship with them, and to just discuss them what really needs to be done and what can we put on a hold maybe in a later process or should be not even performed.
Right, exactly. Just trust them.
Yeah, they're trying to help.
I guess.
Really, and that's the thing that I learned along the years. They're not scary. They really try to help you.
Thank you. We've got 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to end on a kind of nice light note. So I'm going to ask each of you to go around and maybe just give me an example of when peer review has either really helped you or when you've really enjoyed the process of peer review. If you could recount any particular, lessons or moments or anything like that.
I definitely can.
Thank you very much.
One of the nicest, and it shows how peer review can be a lot more personal and interactive than many, or at least I thought, and possibly many others think as well. It's like that first paper that I got absolutely slammed with in my PhD. I ended up taking a couple of writing courses, and it ended up being reasonably good. And one of the peer reviewers in a later stage came back and actually told me it was really well written, which is fantastic for me to hear. And I would love to name this person because it was absolutely fantastic what he did. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he actually put himself forward to actually have a personal one-to-one discussion with me because he really wanted to see the paper that I had written published in that journal. And we ended up having a meeting, him and me, and we discussed through the article that we'd written how it could be improved. And it ended up getting published and was so much more better than it was to start with. So just keep an open mind with peer review, and it can open up to these lovely interactions that you can have, which ultimately improve the articles you write and the science that actually ends up getting published. So that was a nice one that I remember very clearly from early on in my PhD.
Thank you. And that's a lovely example of what you were talking about in terms of putting yourself on the side of the authors, right, as well.
Yeah,
which I think
exactly.
Rebecca, do you have any particular kind of experience?
Yeah, I'll actually talk about an experience that I had as a trainee, as a PhD student. I feel that I was really fortunate to have a mentor in my life who was actually at the time serving as an editor of a major journal in my field. And he was kind enough to ask me on several occasions to be a reviewer, and really kind of took me through the process like with this insider perspective. So I was able to, he would, show me, okay, this other reviewer, look, this is a fantastic review, and here's why. And he also really showed me how much more constructive the reviews that, the reviews that really want to improve the work, sort of like Matt was just saying. So that investment, it's not just checking boxes, this is good, this is bad, fix this, fix that. It's really like, I want to see this in print. I want this to be a contribution to the scientific literature. Here's how we can get there, in my opinion. That was just a really formative experience for me. And I think that's why I feel so strongly about better sort of training in the peer reviewing process.
Thanks so much. And finally, Theo, do you have any particular experience?
Everybody put, I think, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and emotions in these papers. So any criticism in the beginning feels like an attack. But if you settle down a bit, you breathe, in the end, they're usually very good criticisms. And like Rebecca said, if you get a review report and they just try to really help get the paper better, to make suggestions of, for instance, certain experiments, that's great. And sometimes you in the beginning, you think like, well, he didn't understand the paper, but if you take a moment and you reconsider it and you do the experiment and then you write it down again. And then usually at the end, and at least in many cases, I've said, wow, the paper got a lot better. And then you're even more proud of your accomplishment. So always, I would say, like, read the comments, set it back a bit, take a breather, and then look it over again without a lot of emotion, because it always feels like somebody's being maybe attacking you because it's very personal to you. But that's usually my experience. They're trying to help as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are sadly out of time, but thank you, all of you, so much for joining us and for your presentations and answering questions. Yeah, thank you. It's much appreciated by me, and I'm sure our audience as well. Thank you as well to our audience for sending in all their excellent questions and for sharing their experiences, and for joining us. Yeah, thanks. This video and session will be up live on nature.com at some point in the next few days, so you'll be able to rewatch it. But in the meantime, thanks so much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your days, and yeah, thank you.